This is the content for week 6. We're switching over from Illustrator to Photoshop, and so this is going to be a big change because we were working in a vector program before, and now we're working in what's called a bitmap or a continuous tone program. And you have a lot of tools in Photoshop that are similar to Illustrator, but you really have to approach it with a whole different mindset. And so, don't be concerned if it's when you go back and forth between the two, you get a little confused from time to time. If I've been working with Photoshop for a long time, I lose my concentration with Illustrator and vice versa. So let me just go through what you need to read and the videos and all of that for the week. See if there's anything else anything I need to point out to you. Pixels, obviously, I think you guys know what those are. But it doesn't hurt to, just because I assume you know what pixels are doesn't mean I don't want you to read this. Because it's got some, pretty interesting stuff in it. Okay, new document. You guys know how to do that. You can skip that part. Okay, here we go. Brushes. In Photoshop, since you're working with pixels instead of vectors, if you want to make a line, you can make it with a brush freehand. I mean, you have the capability of making a path similar to Illustrator and putting a stroke on it, but at the end of the day, it's still going to be pixels. Or you can just paint with pixels as if you're just sticking them in sticking a paintbrush in a palette full of pixels and sliding them around the screen. Okay, so the first thing is just to play around with the brushes a little bit. Make sure you try out both the the soft edged and the hard edge. Play around with all these. And there's a brush palette with all kinds of cool stuff in there, but we're just kind of exploring right now. So okay, it's just like Illustrator. You have the two color things here. They're slightly different in that in Illustrator, remember, we had one was your fill and the other was your stroke. This time, it's just basically like you have two colors that you can work with at any given time without having to go back to your palette, your color palette, and picking another one. So in Photoshop, they're called foreground and background, and it just really kind of means foreground means this is the color you're working with now, and background means this is the color that you can also work with if you don't want to work with the one that you have now. So you switch back and forth between them just like you do in Illustrator. You can click this little thing right here just to get back to default, just like in Illustrator. So that's similar. Okay, now here's something that's very different, and you'll see this. Make sure you watch the videos I provided for you. When we were in Illustrator, it was object-based, meaning I could, with my black arrow, I could click on an entire shape or shapes and move it. If I wanted to edit that shape, I would go with my white arrow and I would edit the path around the outside by manipulating the handlebars and the anchor points. Photoshop's very different. In Photoshop, let's kind of compare it to almost like you're cutting something out of a piece of paper. And in doing that, you have to create a little dotted line, which we call marching ants, and you'll see why when you start playing with it. You have to create a little dotted line around everything, and basically what that's telling you is everything inside the marching ants can be edited. Everything outside the marching ants cannot. Okay, so in Photoshop, you have to actually define an area. It's not going to recognize one object to the next. All it sees are pixels. It does not care what color they are. You have to figure that part out. Actually, it can figure out the colors, but we'll get to that later. Another thing that's kind of nice is the history panel, something that I use a lot. You can go back several steps if if you mess up or something. You can even put a little mark here saying I want to be able to come back to this one maybe later. So I think you can go back about 20, 30 steps, like it says right here. It depends on your settings, but history panel is really good. It'll help you get out of a lot of messes. Um, Layers, just like in Illustrator, we work with layers. It's different in that on Illustrator we had a lot of vector paths piled up on top of one of each other. In Photoshop, it's just continue each layer to be um, continuous, filled with pixels. They might be with color, they might be without color, but there can only be one pixel in any given spot, and so you have to define the area. And you can either make adjustments to an entire layer or to portions of a layer using a selection. Okay. And let's see. Opacity, just like we had in Illustrator, we have the ability to make layers transparent, which is good. Okay. Getting images. Yeah, just mainly that you can create images from scratch in Photoshop. You have some tools similar to those in Illustrator that can kind of do a pixelated version of what you were doing in Illustrator, but basically Photoshop is for continuous tone images, and so that means that you're primarily the program's used to edit photographs or to work with photographic material, to like make a montage out of various photographic images, or just to take a pre-existing image and either edit it just like a regular photograph or edit it to have some kind of an artistic effect. And it's just pretty much unlimited as to what you can do. Okay, so I think, while you're reading this stuff, I think you should have your program open, of course, and, be kind of playing around with these things. Magic Wand, you don't need the Magic Wand because you have this quick selection tool, so you can skip that part. Okay, but just to show you what Magic Wand or the quick selection tool does this just better, if you want to create a selection of an entire area and it's all the same or very similar in tone, the program can read that. And so what they did here is they clicked right here with the Magic Wand, and it picked up every pixel that was in let's see, that was at a 40 tolerance. So it picked up every pixel that was in a range of 40 on either side of the pixel selected, and it pulled them out. And so since there's a hard, clean line right here, it was very easy for Photoshop to see it. Of course, it didn't get everything, and if you were using the Magic Wand tool, that wouldn't really matter. But if you're using just, for understanding, if you're using, I'm sorry, if you were using continuous, wait a minute. If you were using the other selection tool, sorry, it's really early. I was up late working on this, and I got up real early to work on this, so I'm still kind of waking up. Okay, but anyhow, I don't want you to think that this is just like instant, oh look, all I have to do is click one button and I have this whole thing selected, because it very rarely works out that way. It very rarely works out that it's going to, if you got up close, it's going to look okay on the edges. You can do this in one click, that's all well and good, but you're still going to need to come in and very closely look at all these edges. There's going to be a lot of little bumps and messed up areas, and if you don't clean up those edges, it's very obvious that it's a Photoshop job. Okay, so we don't want that. Quick selection tool, that's the one I was talking about. I like it a lot better than the Magic Wand. Try them both and you'll see. Okay. Lasso tool is a way to free form a selection. I like the way they say here it's one of the crudest selection tools, but also the quickest. This is very true. The lasso tool allows you to, you know, by hand draw a selection around something, and there are ways that you can, you know, edit that selection so that it's precise. It can be very quick, and it may be something you have to use when some of the other selection techniques aren't you know appropriate for the image that you're working with. So give that a try. You don't really need to use it much, but when you do need to use it, there's no other tool that'll work. And I recommend the lasso tool and the polygonal lasso tool, which is a little bit more like a drawing with a path in that you just click and make straight lines. And this can really help you make, you know, some detailed areas here. Magnetic lasso tool, I just say use at your own risk. I don't like it, and I don't encourage my students to use it because if it starts to go haywire, it's kind of hard to get out of, and people freak out and, you know, don't know what they don't know what they did. There's other smart selection tools in there. If you're using Magic Wand, I mean, if you're using the magnetic lasso tool, probably your quick selection tool would work just as well for that. Okay, cropping, you'll be doing a little cropping later. I think that's pretty straightforward. Clone stamp tool. Really don't want to talk about this one without demonstrating something, but it's really cool. I'll find a video for you on the clone stamp. How about that? Okay. The other thing we can do in Photoshop is we can make tonal adjustments, and that's what your first your practice activity is for this week. That'd be practice activity number 3. Is you're going to take a continuous tone image, or you've got a photograph, and you're just going to try all the different ways that you can edit that photograph, not just as a whole. If you don't make a selection, you're going to be applying whatever adjustments you make to the entire layer, and that's all that this is asking you to do. Okay. So there's a bunch of different tools that you can use. Levels, it talks about the histogram. And when you do the activity, you're going to be guided through a few of these different things. Color balance, all sorts of different ways to change colors, to change values, to change tones. Okay, image size. Image size is important. I think that the other book probably explains that just fine, but it never hurts to read it in two places. This will kind of help you understand the relationship between the document size, the resolution, the pixel dimensions, and how good of a quality the image is. Constrained proportions means you're not going to mess it up and make it, you know, short on one side and long on the other side. Okay. Make sure you know what resampling is. Saving, you should be good to go on that. If you have any layers, it's going to automatically try to save as a Photoshop document, because if you say you start out with a JPEG, JPEGs are only capable of one layer. And so if you start with a JPEG and you do just file save, I think it just goes back to a JPEG unless you tell it otherwise, unless you tell it I want a Photoshop document. So, you know, what you do is, it's just like in Illustrator. You've got, actually you have a lot more options in Photoshop for various formats that you can save it as. You know, the two I use the most, of course, is the native Photoshop, and then the JPEG, which you guys are already familiar with. Sometimes the PDF comes into play. There's a few others, but for the most part, these are the two that you're going to be concerned with. Okay, and it's just file, save as. Getting out of trouble, yeah, you probably want to read this part, because You can get yourself into a corner, and there's always a way of getting yourself out. But in remember, the history palette and the undo button are both of your friends. But I'd say these here are the the top things that can go wrong. And probably the first thing that, if it's not doing something that you want it to do, it's like, hey, I told it to adjust this and it's just not doing anything. Check and make sure you're on the right layer, because 9 times out of 10, it's because you're on the wrong layer. Okay. Let's get all of this. And then we've got the next chapter as well. And this goes into layers in more detail. You can have an infinite number of layers. It's got a little bit about filters. I'll let you play with those in a little bit. Filters are extremely cool, or they can be. They can also be extremely yuck. But maybe pull an image up and just try everything in the filter gallery so that you can see. There's so many things you can do. What a lot of artists do is they find some kind of technique that is actually a combination of filters on top of each other, to get some of those really cool Photoshop-y looking surfaces. And there's an infinite number of tutorials out there for how to get this cool surface or how to get that cool surface. Quick mask, I honestly don't use quick mask that much. Basically, it's another way of looking at a selection. Basically, it's just like when we made the clipping path in the exercise for the practice exercise number 2. It's a mask in Photoshop has a similar mindset in that think about whatever is inside that mask as like a hole cut out in a piece of paper, and everything. So if you have the marching ants, everything inside the marching ants is what you're editing. Everything that you can't edit on the outside of the marching ants is considered masked off. But I prefer to use layer masks. I really very rarely use this, but you can just toggle back and forth between a marching ants and a quick mask. But there are some reasons that this can be extremely useful as well. Let's see here. Talks about channels, and you'll experiment with channels when you get into the exercise for this week. You can do fill and stroke like you can in Illustrator, but it's still, at the end of the day, you're just filling it with pixels and you're just stroking it with pixels. So it's not like this infinitely unchanging image. It's if you scale it up, it's going to have to add pixels, and it's going to, if that's too extreme, it's going to have to make some guesswork as to what color you want those pixels to be, and it'll start to look kind of weird. Okay, but you can do fill and stroke. It's a similar concept. Okay, canvas size is important. Really, anything having to do with the image size, you need to be comfortable with. We're going to talk about why soon. Okay. You can work with an infinite number of layers, and life can get a little confusing if I'm serious in that you could easily have a document that has 30, 40, 50 layers in it, and of course, if that happens, it's likely that you'll want to actually group some of those layers into folders. But if you have more than 1 or 2 layers, you probably want to go ahead and take the time to rename them. Okay. Free transform, it talks about how you can change the size or the shape of something with the transform tool. That's important. Layer mask is what I prefer over the quick mask. And I think that if you learn this early on in the program, it's not confusing. I think if you just learn it right away when you're learning layers, it's just going to make perfect sense to you. But, basically what you're doing is you're telling it, remember they drew the selection around this little guy in the other, in the other slide. Okay, well, in this one, If you relate that to a mask, it's just like what I was explaining. The white area here, let's pretend it's the whole, cut out, and the little window cut out in the piece of paper, and let's consider this black area here. Everything is masked out, so it's like a piece of black paper with a hole cut in it. That's about the easiest way that I can explain that. And the thing that's cool about this is you can use a selection with a hard edge to get to this, but you can also have brushes define the edges of masks and make them soft and subtly gradated, and that's the thing that's really, really cool about Photoshop, is working with all the different brush functions that they have. I don't think you need to worry about the type tool in Photoshop. If you're going to do anything with type, we're going to take it back into Illustrator. So, basically the two programs are designed to work cross-platform. If you do, like, say, the illustration, the picture in Photoshop, but you have some text and some graphics that you want, you're going to take that Photoshop image and you're going to actually place it in the Illustrator file. And in the Illustrator file, you'll do the type tool. Because, again, in Illustrator, the type is vector. And that's better for things like type than in Photoshop. It's going to be similar, but at the end of the day, it's still pixels again. And you're not going to have that, razor sharp edge. You're going to have the fuzzy pixel edge. Okay, so I really don't see, if you know how to use Illustrator, I see no reason at all to bother with the type tool. But read this anyway, and play around with it, because it will help you understand the difference between the vector and the bitmap. Okay, and I guess I'll take that back. One reason that you might want to use the type tool is if you want to do some kind of effect inside the letters, some kind of continuous tone effect inside the letters. So I take it back. I do want you to read this section, especially paying attention to the rasterize part. Okay, so that's all I had for chapter 6. Chapter, I think it's 8 in your other one. Let's see here. Okay, chapter 8, tonal scale. Let me open that up real quick and see if there's anything else I want to point out to you. Trying to find the link to the book. Where did I put that link? Oh, you know what? I've got a copy of it on my desktop. I'll just look for it there. Oh, wait, here's chapter 8. That's what I want. Okay. Oh, okay, so this is going to tell you a lot of the same stuff that you learned in the other book, but it, as always, there's a different approach, and this one makes a lot more emphasis on the appearance of the image. Photoshop, the Adobe Basics, it just talks about what Photoshop can do. As far as tools go, this actually focuses more on the image, and it's talking about, critically looking at the image and saying, okay, well, this area looks blown out, this area looks a little dark, I need to get some more detail in this area, or something like that. So, and it's all based, Photoshop is all based on traditional film photography. A lot of the functions that it has are kind of mimic and traditional techniques that photographers would use in the darkroom. And so you do need to have a kind of a basic understanding of what real photography, sorry, not real photography, but traditional photography is. Okay, so camera to computer, you've got this whole exercise that you need to go through, and so I have a video for you on that. Okay, so I'm not going to go over it here. Let me get back to where we were. Okay. in your to do this. Oh, okay. I've got a bunch of videos for you. I'll probably add a few more after I make this recording. So don't be surprised if there's more than this in there. But these are two. You might even want to watch the videos before you do your reading. I think that would probably be a good idea, so that when you're doing your reading, you can have the program open and be playing around with it. You know, trying things out as you read about them. But both of these are really good. These two. Videos that are actually, these are websites that are not showing up very well. Um, this is for Project 3, so I will talk about these guys when I give you a video on Project 3. Um, and so let me just show you what's inside the To Do This Week folder. And remember, I bumped your due date back on all of this stuff, so you've got exactly a week, and I think that's ample time. That both of these exercises are not difficult at all. I don't think I don't think the practice assignment is anywhere near as hard as the first and second one that we did. And then the double exposure, don't even try this until after you've done all your readings and done the practice assignment. Don't even try it. This actually is a very easy project. It's only worth 50 points. I'll explain in the video, but I don't want you to make more of this project than it is. This is not really meant to be doing any kind of intricate selection or anything like this. This is just simply making a composite of 2 layers and playing around with your transparency. So I will explain that in another video, and then this folder has some really cool stuff that some of my former students did, and I'll point out a few things there. Okay, so that is your week 6. And just make sure you read everything before you try the assignments, okay?